In this video, we're going to look at the difference between news reporters and news influencers. Where do you get your news about politics? People have different preferences about the types of media they like to consume. Some people prefer to read the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, or maybe the Globe and Mail. Other people prefer to get their news through digital platforms and social media channels. Each one is going to present a different type of content, and we're going to look at the difference. And for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to use two broad categories. News reporters and journalists on one hand versus news influencers and or content creators on the other. By using these two groups, we can identify differences in the process for gathering and reporting on news, different incentive structures, and then of course the different types of content that will be produced. Let's start with traditional reporting and journalism. Typically, reporters will work for a large, established news organization. Their job is to attend events. They try and go to political news conferences, they might interview people, they might read primary documents, and based on that first-hand experience, they prepare a first-hand account of what happened. They document the event, they document their experience, the interviews, maybe they're interpreting press releases, and then they publish that story. But there are some bureaucratic steps that need to happen in the interim. There is an editor that is involved in this process, and typically the editor might assign stories. They might assign reporters to cover one story or another. They might review the story before it gets published in terms of physically editing for content, but also for style. They might add a new headline, maybe change the photos. And it's also possible that they might even need involvement from a lawyer. If it's a piece of investigative reporting and they're worried about the accuracy, it will need to be edited thoroughly, but also vetted by a lawyer to ensure that the outlet does not get sued. That's part of the incentives of these big outlets. They don't want to publish anything that's going to see them in court, especially in the second Trump administration. A lot of accusations towards media outlets and threats of legal action. So if you are in a news setting like this, you want to be sure that the content you are producing is verifiable and it's accurate. Then you can publish it. Let's compare that to content creators and or news influencers, however you want to characterize them. Rather than working for big news organizations, they tend to be independent. They work on their own, and when they create content, when they comment on the news, what they're typically doing is drawing on news that's already been published. Typically it shows up somewhere in a different media outlet. They will use that, they'll take their cues from that, add their own commentary, and sometimes that is overtly partisan, right? They might have a very specific partisan frame to their style and to their presentation. Our side is good, the other side is terrible. And they're making that content specific to their audience, their subscribers, or a group of followers. And so once that content is published, they often rely on virality, algorithmic distribution or amplification. And sometimes these creators might even use A/B testing. They might try and experiment with different formats, different types of stories to see which one gets the most traction and see which one will spread the furthest, get them the best reach. Now, there's advantages and disadvantages to each of these. If we look at news influencers first, they can be more responsive in terms of news that's breaking and unfolding quickly. It's easier for them to turn around a story than it is for a traditional reporting outlet that's got to go through those bureaucratic hurdles. They have to follow a process of vetting and editing, whereas news influencers don't need to do that. They can just spit out the content much quicker. Now with that, the sort of flip side is accuracy. Can they be sure it's accurate? They don't necessarily have to follow the same procedures for vetting and ensuring accuracy. There's also the incentive to do so. They might not necessarily have an incentive to do that, especially if they do have an overt partisan lean to their audience. They don't really care if it's accurate. They just want it to be congenial to that partisan audience. Certain tactics might be common to news influencers, sort of ambush journalism, or grabbing people on the street or showing up places and trying to catch people by surprise, which sort of gives the appearance of confusion and corruption. You'll also notice that many of these kind of look the same. That's a concept called aesthetic mimicry. They all sort of want to have the same look and feel to them. And again, the sort of incentives aren't necessarily the same as those with traditional reporting. In fact, Steve Bannon often talked about the goal of news, these partisan news influencers rather, is just to spit out content as quickly as they could, as much as they could, because traditional news outlets aren't equipped to keep up with that. They have to follow their own procedures, and their organizations just aren't built to respond as quickly as these sort of content creators, news influencers are. If we look at the journalism side of it, there is more accuracy built into the process. A story gets vetted, quotes have to be verified, and an editor approves it before it goes out the door. It is much slower. So you get more accuracy, but they also can't turn around and respond to events as quickly as independent influencers can do. Now the incentives, of course, the incentives are to take the time because they have to worry about legal liability. On the flip side, like in terms of the negatives, some personalities have left outlets because of what they describe as groupthink or bias. And that it's possible that editors might discourage reporters to report on a certain type of event or to cover a certain story. They might be discouraged from pursuing certain angles. And so that can happen, especially when you get journalists that many have gone through higher education, many of them are from large cities, and so socioeconomically you get the same group of people, and that kind of groupthink can take hold. Now, how is this connected to political attitudes? Well, it can run in a couple of different directions. For example, being exposed to a lot of hyper-partisan content can increase polarization. That's a thing that can happen. If you're already a person that's skeptical and a low-trust individual, you might be attracted to some of these more salacious outlets that maybe rely on misinformation. And so these are very much connected to political attitudes, and there's a lot of interesting research that's happening that tries to explore the link between different types of media consumption, political attitudes, and polarization. I will say, it's a nice, easy way to describe this, is looking at a binary distinction between reporting and influencers, but there's a big gray area in the middle. There are some independent media outlets, foundation-based outlets, independent people working on newsletters like Substack that do great work. They are, in many cases, ex-journalists. They have come from working at a large organization, and so they bring with them the set of practices and attitudes that are consistent with traditional journalism. So if maybe you have an aversion to larger media outlets, there are people that work at, again, independent and foundation-funded media outlets that do great work and that are accurate. And they sort of straddle that line between actual reporting and sort of commentary/news influencers. So just to recap, conceptually we can think of these as two different worlds. There's the sort of journalistic news reporting world versus the content creator/news influencer ecosystem. They're very, very different in the types of processes they follow, the incentives that drive that, and the types of content they produce.